Okay, thank you for joining us today. We are here with the proponents of Proposition 16, Dr. Shirley Weber from the State Assembly, Vincent Pan, and Michelle Ciccados. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 45 minutes to an hour, and we'll start with a brief presentation before we go into the board's questions. So Dr. Weber, why don't you please start?
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning and to have this conversation with you. While it lists me as the author of the bill, I represent a huge coalition of various caucuses in the Assembly who were supportive of this initiative, and somehow or another, fate always seems to have how another, even though my name is W, I end up always at the top of the list as the person who's the author of the bill. But nonetheless, I think the unique thing for me is that that I've not only, as you probably know, spent time in the last 8 years in the Assembly, but prior to that, spent 40 some odd years at the university as a professor and on the school board, and was very familiar with the implementation of affirmative action and the kinds of opportunities that people could have as regards to folks being mindful of the issues of race and gender. And so I was able to see not so much always the negative that people saw, but the really positive outcomes that could happen when you have that as a variable to be considered, not as the only variable, but one of many variables to be considered. And saw positive things at the university, but equally or more important, because people have a tendency to focus only at the university, I saw tremendous progress and positive things in the K-12 system as a member of the school board, but equally important as a person who looked at the differences that existed and the different opportunities that people had and how we could change that by being mindful and focused on particular issues that people face. Those of you if you'd been in San Diego during those early years, you would have seen in the early 90s that we had data that showed us that African-American males were doing horrible in our public schools. Lack of self-esteem, lack of role models, all those kinds of things. And so our school board developed a whole program around it, focused on African-American males, but other students could participate as well. And we saw the numbers of about 30 some odd students who had B or better averages that the Union-Tribune reported at the time, go from that small number to over 500 and 600 African-American males doing well in our schools, getting B or better averages, focused on going to college, role models that we brought into the school system to accomplish that. We had very few teachers who were role models. And so we developed a whole program focused on the military and African-American men coming out of the military, putting together a program to help them get their teaching credential in about a year and a half, using USIU as our example, as a place that we use to get their credential. And we saw the change that was occurring. The same was true with Latina females. We had a special program for them. The same was true with Hmong children, young Hmong women whose parents didn't have the culture of going to school and doing well. So we developed these programs that were specifically designed to respond to an issue that we had, and we saw progress. After Prop 209 passed, we had to dismantle all of those programs. And they all then had to serve everybody, and they had to be scattered around the district, and we couldn't focus upon particular issues and particular concerns for kids. And as a result, we saw the numbers begin to plummet again. We saw the lack of focus upon those issues that needed to be addressed, and we were not as effective as we could have been. And the same is true across the board when we began to look at what we did with contracting in city schools, what we did with contracting in the city of San Diego, creating opportunities, much more than saying that we're targeting a group and we're going to disadvantage certain people. But what we did was we recognized that our system was flawed, that we had inequalities in our system, and we then began to address it. We face the same problem in San Diego City at the state level right now. As you know, we're dealing with this whole issue of achievement gap. And we've developed this whole program of local control funding formula. And some of you know my ongoing battle with that issue. But we have been ineffective in really getting the hardcore issues because we're not able to focus upon African Americans who are at the very bottom. We have to focus on economic issues and language issues and other issues. And what happens is we get to some of it, but we never get to all of it. And that's the ongoing challenge we face right now. And we will continue to face those kinds of challenges unless we have the opportunity to basically understand and focus on particular issues that may have race or gender basis for it. And not to necessarily say that we're discriminating against everybody else, but we're recognizing the fact that we have some serious and systemic problems that are 400 years old plus. And as a result of that, it will not solve itself by simply us saying the world is equal, let us move forward. So what Prop 209 has done, it has banned our ability to focus on problems we have and to try to fashion some kind of program or something that would help us achieve it. In the end, you have to still compete. You know, when I was a undergrad student, I didn't get in on affirmative action because it wasn't there. I'm too old. I was older than the programs. But I was old enough when I got ready to go to grad school. And I didn't know if I was going to go. And I had no role model, no one to tell me about it other than one person at the whole university. And I got into grad school, and I think I became a Woodrow Wilson Fellow because of affirmative action. Because when I compared my data to everybody else in the room, I didn't have the highest grade point average, but I had the highest grit in terms of a person starting where I started coming out of an inner city school in LA and where I ended up on the dean's list at UCLA. And so if you just looked at the numbers, you say, maybe so. But the conversation made me a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. And then there was a GAP program, a graduate advancement placement program that existed to help grad students to do well. And I had a mentor and a role model in Malefi Asante. And so what happened was I never would have thought of a PhD. I never would have thought of those kinds of things. My dad, when I said, Dad, they want me to get a PhD, his answer was, what is that? And I told him what it was. I told him, I said, it'll take a while. I said, but you know, it's the highest academic degree you can get. And his response was, let us go get it. He had no idea what it was, but the GAP program helped him focus, helped me focus, helped me achieve the things that I needed to achieve. And that's what happens when you have affirmative action. I had to write all the papers. I had to do the dissertation. I had to take the language exam in Italian. I had to do everything required, but it never would have been an opportunity if there hadn't been a program that said, we need more African-American professors. We need more African-Americans with PhDs in certain areas that can make a difference. And I think when I deal with my students, that the thousands of students I've helped at San Diego State, that I made a difference as a role model for them, that they look and they say, you know, had it not been for you, I never would have stayed. I never would have done this. I didn't know about these opportunities. I wouldn't have gone to grad school. And that's what we're talking about. Affirmative action is really an opportunity that we have to basically change the narrative, to change the direction and respond to the issues that we face in California and across this nation. And that's why I feel so passionate about it, because I know that it works when it's done mindfully and when we have intentions to do it right. And I think we've done some of that in California in the past.
I can add just a bit as part of our opening presentation, and then I think Michelle maybe can close us. First, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Vincent Pan. I'm the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, and also one of the co-chairs of the Yes on 16 campaign. With a group name like Chinese for Affirmative Action, you may think that we were started to work on this campaign, but we have actually been around for 51 years, long before the whole concept of affirmative action became controversial. We've led campaigns to build a community college campus in San Francisco, Chinatown. We went to the Supreme Court in the Lau versus Nichols case that established the right for non-English language learners to have a public education. We've helped desegregate different parts of civil service in San Francisco, including the police department, firefighters, and on and on. I just wanted to add a couple things to what Dr. Weber shared. And the first is to remind you all that Prop 209 was a ban. And when government bans things, it often has unintended consequences, as many of you know. And so by banning affirmative action, it actually was much too heavy-handed. It eliminated the ability for our society to take on many common sense solutions that I think all of us would agree on have a place in society. And so whether that's saying, okay, you know, it's okay to have a STEM program for girls so that they could have more exposure to science camps and technology. To say that in our police departments, we should be cognizant of the racial diversity of those who are in our police force. That when we look at the upper ranks of government, we should be mindful of the representation of women to make sure that there is, you know, diverse gender perspectives as we think about all the important things that government does. And so Prop 209 really was far-reaching and banned all those things. In contrast, Prop 16 is not a mandate. It simply eliminates the ban. So before any affirmative action programs would move forward, the responsibility to decide what to do would fall upon local government. It would fall upon local school districts. It would fall upon local communities. And not only would it fall to them to decide to take action or not, since Prop 209 was passed, there have been a number of federal legal rulings that would also constrain what these local agencies and entities could do. Namely, that since Prop 209 passed, legally speaking, before any race or gender conscious program could move forward, there would have to be a thoughtful, robust analysis, that you would have to demonstrate that some type of disparate impact was occurring. Okay? After establishing that, you would also then have to demonstrate that a race or gender neutral approach would not be effective. Then after that, you could use race and or gender, but only one of many factors and never as the determinative factor. So Prop 16 actually opens up the possibility, but with many, many safeguards to prevent the type of bad things that I think the opponents of Prop 16 are trying to scare people into thinking will happen, and whether that's quotas, whether that's discrimination. The Constitution, US Constitution, is really clear, or the Supreme Court has ruled that quotas cannot come back. They will not be part of the equation. And we also know that all the other protections against discrimination still remain in place. And so, again, Prop 16 creates opportunities for us to address in many practical local ways disparities and inequities that I think all of us want to take on. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michelle, a couple minutes to you.
Sure. First, thanks again for having us and allowing us to chat with you about why we think this is so important. Like Dr. Shirley Weber, I was the first in my family to go to college. I attended college in the 90s. I was actually a graduate student on an affirmative action fellowship at UCLA in 1995 through 97. So I was there when the UC Regents passed the ban on admissions. I was there when the voters passed Prop 209, and I got to see firsthand what happened as a result. And what happened as a result was really tragic. In essence, we saw a huge dip in the number of applicants and admitted African-American and Latinx students into the University of California. So part of the intended consequence was for that to happen. And the unintended was for students who were quite capable and eligible to just feel like they were not welcome. And as a result, over the last 24, 25 years, many have focused on admissions to the University of California, but the admissions to graduate school programs has resulted in the fact that because of Prop 209, we have thousands of, fewer doctors that are Latinx or African-American than we would have had otherwise. And in the midst of a global pandemic, when we know that culturally responsive and medical professionals are essential, it truly is tragic. That's the consequence. We also see that it isn't just about university admissions. However, when we look at higher education in California a few years ago, the Campaign for College Opportunity, which is the organization I lead, did an analysis on the lack of diversity by race and gender in higher ed. And we found that even though 69% of undergraduates at our community colleges, at our Cal States, at our UCs are students of color, overwhelmingly, the tenured faculty, 63% are white. When you look at system leadership, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white. So a huge lack of representation. I know a lot is said about the University of California having, a large representation of Asian American students, and we know that some of the opposition is coming from a small sector of the Asian American community. And the reality is that in the UCs, Asian American faculty are incredibly underrepresented. While UC students, that are Asian American make up about 30 I think, is it 34, 39%? Now I'm gonna mix some of the stats, so Vin will correct me. But in terms of senior leaders in the UC, it's only 8%. In terms of tenured faculty, it's only 14%. So this is about everything. It isn't just about university admissions, as important as that is. It is about hiring. And when we look at K-12 and in San Diego, your own reporting has highlighted the incredible underrepresentation. We have schools in San Diego that don't have a single Black teacher. That should be unacceptable, because we know that it is those teachers that help us see the possibilities in ourselves when we are women or students of color. And it is those teachers also that expose all students. So it isn't just about having Latino teachers for Latino students. It's important for white students to have Latino teachers, for Asian students to have Latino teachers, and for Latino students to have Asian teachers too. So we live in a global society, in a diverse state. And so I think that this lack of representation is just simply unacceptable. And this is a possibility, a solution for us to fix that.
Your guys' cause is undoubtedly notable. It makes all the sense in the world to try to do what you're trying to do. But I've been stunned at the op-eds I've seen in support of your proposition, because none of them acknowledges that college admissions is a zero-sum game. When you give admission to one person, you're denying it to another person. And the fact is that similar programs in Wisconsin and in the Ivy Leagues have led to Asian kids not being admitted on the grounds of responding to white racism. So I just wish we'd have some intellectual honesty here. The program is noble, the cause is noble, but when it's been enacted elsewhere, it has led not to a white kids suffering, but to Asian American kids suffering. There's a 20% quota on Ivy League admissions in Princeton and Harvard, and there has been for many, many years. In Wisconsin, there's ample evidence that Asian American kids are the ones who've suffered when these policies are adopted. So I just wish that the people with this noble cause would be candid about the fact that this is a zero-sum game. Who loses?
Let me respond. The first thing is that there are more Asian Americans in City College of San Francisco than in all of the Ivy Leagues. So it's very, very problematic to compare like the most selective elite university admissions that have a very different legacy of privilege and elitism than with what's going on with Prop 16, which is really about all of the public sector, both public employment, public contracting, and also public education. And when you look at the University of California, we know a couple of things. So that prior to Prop 209, Asian representation at the UCs was over 30%. It continues to be over 30%. I think as noted in one of your editorials, the largest increase has been international students. And we also know that there have been large increases of out-of-state students. So university admissions is very complicated, it's very nuanced, and in some cases it is zero-sum. CAA has fought discrimination against Asian Americans in every aspect of society. And there is discrimination against Asian Americans in admissions, you're right. But the cause of that discrimination is not affirmative action. Oftentimes we compare it to the Jewish American experience and the anti-Semitism that they fought at some of these elite universities. The solution there was not to say, well, let's eliminate programs for women, let's eliminate programs for people of color. The solution was to fight the anti-Semitism. So at places like Harvard or Princeton, where there may be discriminatory practices against Asian Americans, and not just in admissions, but again, also in faculty, also in staffing, like the solution is to have oversight. The solution is to have cultural competency. The solution is to have more diversity, Asian American diversity, that would come about as a result of affirmative action in the staffing, in the admissions office, and on and on and on. So I think that we have to be smart, and we're trying to help communicate with folks that, that these in some ways are a conflation of different challenges, that we can grow UC, that we can make space for everyone. But we also have to be clear that the discrimination that Asian Americans face is not a result of affirmative action. Affirmative action has helped Asian Americans across the board for decades.
And I think on your point of the zero-sum game, we have been for years fighting for more funding for higher education, because one of the solutions is to expand enrollment in the University of California. The reality is that we have more students than ever that are eligible to go to college. We have more students that recognize that they need a college degree, right, in this society in order to move forward and actually have a living wage. And so, along with Assemblymember Weber, we've been in the front lines fighting to expand access to the University of California. And I think just the only other point I'd like to add to the comment is that Vincent, I think so eloquently responded to, is that, affirmative action isn't the enemy of those things. We tend to ignore legacy admits that happen at these very highly selective colleges. Those are really, driving force. The wealthy that are privileged and connected and powerful that are really, I think, the bigger problem in admissions in higher ed.
There's also lots of aspects to Prop 16 that clearly I think would not be zero sum. So when we think about, for example, programs that would make sure women are able to advance professionally in the public sector, when we think about programs that acknowledge that women make maybe 70 cents, 80 cents on the dollar that men make. Like, I don't think it's a zero sum as a man to want women to make equal pay for equal work. And so it is true that in the most select university settings, that it can become more zero sum. But for all of California, that's not the case. And I think we can do much, much better trying to promote, opportunity for everyone, and that none of us really benefit in the long run from the type of disparities that we're seeing. So, and that's seeing that people of color are disproportionately dying during the COVID crisis. That doesn't help anybody. Or to know that the unemployment rates for Asian Americans, as well as African Americans and Latinos, have skyrocketed disproportionately during this economic downturn. And those problems require specific remedies. And 90% of businesses owned by women and people of color were not able to access the federal PPP program when it was first rolled out, right? And so I know in the long run, all of society will be better when we remove these barriers that each of our communities may face.
We published an op-ed from the no side that raised a kind of a fundamental point here, which they say that this treats citizens differently based on immutable characteristics. So how do you square the fundamental issue that you're trying to kind of cure some of these systemic racist problems by racial means?
It's the most effective way, and it's also the most direct way, and you have to do it with care and with oversight. But to do otherwise is to willfully put blindfolds on and to tie our hands behind our back. And we will continue to have the deep divisions and disparities that we're seeing now. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't come out of the effectiveness of race-neutral policies, nor did the Me Too movement. I think that we'd like to get to that place. And I think Dr. Weber has put it eloquently so many times. We'd like to get to that place, but we're not there yet. And so we simply have to add to that. For what purpose? And it's not the same to say, well, you're considering race to address discrimination as it is just to say you're considering race to discriminate. And I think we are mature enough as a society to be able to know the difference. And you look at why people are in the streets protesting. Let's just take police violence. If you create a police accountability board and you're staffing it to review police misconduct and police violence, does it really make sense to literally make it illegal to consider the race and ethnicity of the people that you're hiring? When we know, everyone knows that race is part of the problem. It may not be the only problem, but so it's simply doing what the private sector already does. And imagine that you do at your newspaper to make sure that you have diversity on your staff and in your leadership so that you can cover San Diego effectively. Should not government, with its important responsibilities, have the ability to do that when it proves that it will be effective and be necessary?
Dr. Weber or Michelle, you want to add to that?
No, I think Vincent answered it correctly. I mean, surely, if you're going to solve the problem, you have to confront the problem, and you have to find remedies based on the problem itself. As a result of having 209, we, as I pointed out, with what we're trying to do with achievement gaps in the state, we find ourselves basically taking a shotgun approach to it, being somewhat effective occasionally, but not really focused upon the issues that we face. And as a result, it takes us longer, it takes us far more resources, and we're less effective in accomplishing it. And so if we're dealing with the fact that there's all this systemic racism and sexism that exists, pretending that all of a sudden blowing it away is going to make it better, it does not solve the problem. And many of our corporations and entities, even as your paper has begun to look at it and say, hey, in order to solve these things, we have to basically get beyond the usual things that we do, where we usually advertise, where we usually recruit individuals. And we have to really be mindful of the fact that diversity matters, and that and it changes not the quality of what we want as a final product. And while it may be uncomfortable initially for some folks to think about that, it is necessary as you move forward, because then it becomes a part of the culture of the company. It becomes a part of the culture of the operation and the business that we do. We've gotten away from that, and that's unfortunate, because we have not had an opportunity to be mindful of the fact that that diversity matters in everything we do, and that there are people qualified to do the job, and that they can do it if we just simply change what we do and focus in a different way and do that. So yes, it will require us looking at those issues that we face, but not looking at them will not solve them, and they will not go away. And we will constantly have these eruptions in our society with regards to people once again saying that the world is not fair, it is not just, and that we don't have a chance. And to say, oh yeah, but the world is, we have these basic principles of equality and justice for all that we've always had in our institutions, in our constitutions, in our documents, and yet we haven't had the implementation of it, and that's what's important.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, African-American conservative intellectual, has argued that we need to focus on socioeconomic status in deciding who to help. There have been lawsuits in Michigan and in Texas in which poor white students argued that they were denied admission to prestigious state schools because of their race, even though they were impoverished and faced rough lives growing up. So I just wonder what your reaction is to the argument that there's more poor people who are white in America than any other race, and what about the effects that this policy might have on them in college admissions?
I'm not sure if, well, I think the data is fairly clear that being white and and especially being male in this country is a tremendous advantage, regardless of your education, period. We know that. And that a person who, and I don't have all the data, we have the data before us, and you have it, obviously. But the fact that being white, being male, opens up for you a bright future if you work hard. Being African American, and even with a college degree, I can tell you is a difficult task in this country, and it's not always rewarded with the same kind of reward that we give others. So, clearly there will be those who complain. And when we have affirmative action, people complain. Without it, people complain. If the people say, well, it's going to be economic, it's going to be this, someone's going to complain because they believe they have a right and a stake in that place, even though that may be a competitive situation. That they would not have gotten the position anyway. So to say that as a result, all white that are poor are going to be disadvantaged is basically a statement that is so untrue, because of the fact that the day they're born, there is an advantage that comes with that, being white and being male. And despite whether they get admitted to the university or not, there will be an advantage that's there, whether it's in businesses, contracting, whether getting loans for your business, all those kinds of things. Evidence shows that the economic gap, the opportunities are still there, and that even with a college degree, a person of color is still going to struggle a lot harder than a white male who has no college degree, who barely has a high school diploma. You look at the composition of the assembly, and what you find in the assembly is that the people of color who are in the assembly are vetted harder than anyone else, and we all have college degrees and multiple degrees, in fact, when you look at them. And yet many of our colleagues who are doing the same work, who are considered just as good, sometimes even better, barely have high school diplomas. and yet they're considered to be acceptable in the assembly. And that's okay. But I'm just saying the opportunities are different. If I were an African-American female with a high school diploma, I would be looked at very differently than an African-American with a PhD from UCLA in terms of the qualifications. I have been even on the school board. When I served on the school board, most of the individuals, a lot of the individuals on the school boards didn't have college degrees, may have done some college. I had more degrees than all of them. And so it becomes important to recognize the tremendous amount of discrimination that still exists. And in every aspect of life, I'm not sure, we're not sure the academic qualifications of our current president. We kind of know, but we definitely know what Barack Obama did. We definitely know how he did in school and his degrees and his activities at law school and so forth and so on. Why? Because that's a part of the vetting, that's a part of the racism that we face and the attitude that my father told me, and I unfortunately still live, that you have to be twice as good. And so there isn't a disadvantage in that at all. There's always an advantage to the other side.
Dr. Weber and Michelle, I think my background aligns a lot with yours, so I do understand some of the things that you're talking about, being the first to go to college and that sort of thing. I think there still is a lot of misconceptions in the world and in our community too, that all Latinos are in one voting block and have the same experience, as well as Asians and those of us that are people of color know that that is not the truth. So what would you say to voters who might not have the experience of being a person of color, who are going to go to the polls and try to vote on this issue, but might not have that personal experience, and may be confused about what this really means, what the bottom line for this prop really means? What would you say to them?
Did you want to go first, Michelle? Oh, okay.
I was going to let you go first, Dr. Weber.
Okay.
But I can go.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Laura, for that question, because you're absolutely right? None of us are monolithic in our experience or in the way we vote or we address some of these issues, and first, I think maybe we should lead with the reality, like any proposition or any initiative, this is not a panacea to solve every problem in California on race, but it is a really powerful tool. So that's the bottom line. That's what I would tell. That's what I would tell my parents. That's what I would tell my friends, is that this is a tool. It gives our local governments, it gives our universities another tool to use to ensure that that they are dealing with the real effects of racism, as Dr. Weber has aptly described, and are able to target programs and resources where they're needed. So, I just think it's so powerful to really focus on, if you have a problem, if you don't have enough Latino students or Black students that are being prepared for college, because our schools are the most segregated they've been in decades in California, because we know that preparation for college, is very different by race, that you would be able to target resources to address and confront that problem. Otherwise, it's sort of like, again, like this idea of color blindness to me is really just passive aggressive racism. It's not just sticking your head in the sand, but it's actually still racist, but you get to hide behind this sort of emblem of equality to just do nothing to address the real challenges that we face.
Interestingly enough, the African-American population is probably the most familiar group with affirmative action. That when you actually begin to have a conversation and you explain it to them, they understand it probably more than any of the other ethnic groups because of their experience in this country. And they understand when we've had conversations, sometimes they're confused about what the initiative will do. When we explain the initiative to them, it's like a 180-degree shift in terms of them, like, oh, now they understand, because that is what they're familiar with, and that is affirmative action, and they understand that equal opportunity and the opportunity that's there. So our key with the African-American community, with me, is really explaining to them that this is what it is, this is what it's all about, and they thoroughly understand it. But equally important, those who have who have basically struggled with the issue of race in this country. And I always tell my colleagues, I hate to compare, those who have the hardest and the worst conditions and so forth and so on, because, racism, sexism is bad for every group, period. And so I don't like to say, well, Black folks are more oppressed than anybody else. And yet our history and our legacy is much longer and deeper than a lot of the others. And oftentimes we benefit, interestingly enough, the least from programs like affirmative action. But interestingly enough, we still believe in it because of the fact that it does open up opportunities. It does begin to crack open some of the ceilings of limited opportunity. And many of them have faced that because that's one of the things we can't escape. Being African American, people see it in your face. They see who you are. Where others may be, oh, I wonder if she's really Latino, or is she white, or is she this, or is she that? And so as a result, you don't always get that in every case that comes across. But it does in African Americans. And so we face the kind of discrimination that is very apparent to us on a regular basis. And as a result, when we start talking about how do we level the playing field, they understand that. They understand that no matter how hard they've tried, or their parents have tried, or others have tried, there's always been this, not a glass ceiling, as I argue, a steel ceiling, which is totally different than a glass ceiling. And has far more consequences and is a greater challenge than a glass ceiling. And so as a result, we have to, they understand that. And so, and even those who have privilege understand it, African Americans, those who are federal judges that I've talked to, those who are physicians, those who are basically corporate individuals who understand it. They understand it quite well, because they know the struggle that they've been involved in, and they know how hard it is, and they know how hard it is to sustain any kind of change and opportunity in the society that's there. So when I talk to African Americans, and I talk to a lot of them about it, it's really about basically creating opportunity. They know there's not gonna be a panacea, that it's not gonna be, everybody's gonna get a job and every business is gonna work and every this and every that. But they also know that their only hope in this country is to try to figure out what we're going to do to change the direction that we're going, especially having been here as long as we've been here, longer than the Mayflower, and still find ourselves struggling with issues of economic inequality, lack of business support, poor quality in schools. I mean, you go down the list, and it's a difficult list that you go down. But I continue to be amazed at particularly the communities of color, particularly African-American communities, who still believe that this country has a chance, who still believe that that this country can change, that they can create, that we are being the richest country in the world, almost the 5th largest economy in the world, that we have the opportunity to really make a difference, and they're optimistic that we can change. And like I said, having been through so many different movements and so many race riots and so many, I continue to be amazed at the optimism that they believe that California can change, that this nation can change, that we can actually turn the corner and be a better nation by doing some things that we know that are fair and that are right and that are just. And so I continue to be amazed, and I encourage them continue to have that optimism, because that's probably more than anything, it would be the skepticism that this is not going to work, that we have to be optimistic, because this is the only alternative you have other than absolute chaos for people who are frustrated and who are tired of constantly struggling and hitting the wall and not having their fair share. Not that they want anything special, but just an opportunity to basically have fair treatment. To have fair treatment and have a society that looks and understands the challenges they face and try to mitigate those challenges with opportunity. It's extremely important.
Let me ask you about that, because polls show that most people oppose this right now. About 33%, 31%, and the latest PPIC poll shows that people support it in California, but 47%, so nearly half already, oppose it. How do you break through? And once you do a deeper dive into the data, you look at the whites, 51% opposed, Republicans, 72% opposed. How do you reach those people, and why, in this racial reckoning that America is having, this kind of long overdue racial reckoning post George Floyd, why are those numbers not different? Why are 2 out of 3 people either opposed or undecided?
Well, what we see in our internal numbers is that once we explain this to people, folks move very quickly to our side, and that a lot of the folks who are still undecided are, in fact, our base of African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, Asian Americans, and that the wording of this ballot measure is a little bit confusing. And so more than anything, it is to clear up, our job is to clear up that confusion. The other thing is, I think all of you know, is it's a crowded ballot, and there's plenty in the news cycle, right? So it's, I think, not been the best opportunity to be able to make a case with no other things in the news right now. But we're confident. I think just anecdotally, once we explain this to folks quickly get it, and they see this as something concrete that we can do to try and address some of the problems that we've had. And most of people realize that it's nothing radical. This happens in 42 other states. It happens in our private sector. The idea of having, better representation and diversity to make our government and institutions more effective. That these things are well within the mainstream.
Yeah, and I would just only add, Matthew, to that is that I just got my ballot on Saturday, and I spent about an hour yesterday going through all the other initiatives I'm not working on, which is 11, to educate myself in terms of what my position is. So, I wouldn't overread into the PPIC poll. I think it's very early. People, most voters, even informed voters, don't know what all 12 initiatives would do. And we just got on the air last week. And so, we expect to be very active in helping to educate voters about what Prop 16 will do.
Yeah. One thing that will clearly help us is that, we really have an amazing coalition of everyone from the teachers to the nurses to Democratic Party to Senator Harris to the ACLU to the founders of Black Lives Matter to the Asian Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to Kaiser Permanente. I mean, we can go on and on and on. I think, and part of what will happen is as our coalition starts to get the word out to folks, I think folks will start to see which side is which. And that'll help us a great deal.
A quick follow-up, you said 42 states. So what are is there a spectrum on those 42 states or what is the status?
Spectrum?
Yeah, what is the status? You said 42 states basically allow
42 states,
action?
Yes, that's right. So basically after this passed, in the history of this, that when Governor Pete Wilson was thinking about running for president, he put this on the ballot as a way to kind of drum up his credentials with a very conservative white base. And after it passed in California, they cloned it in other states. They went to 8 other states to do it. It includes states like Arizona, I think Michigan, Texas. Don't have all of them at the top of my head. And so this would be the first one to start to turn things back the other way. And so this is, I think, again, trying to make right with the past in order to go forward. But this came about, during 209 came about during the time of 187 and a lot of other measures that were really designed to divide the community. So this would be a step forward for the country too.
And that was a question I had too. So none of those 8 other states have tried this. They've all banned affirmative action and then stayed the course.
Washington State, I believe last year tried to amend it. It wasn't a straight repeal of the ban. They tried to tinker with it. I think it came within 1 percentage point, but that's the only one that I'm aware.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you draw some consolation from the indications that we're going to get a very new and different kind of voter this time around. And I wonder, you've got the NBA and the NFL and everybody else is pushing to get out there and vote. I'm wondering, do you think that's actually going to come to pass, or will we once again see voting numbers in the 60s percentile?
Well, we're hopeful. I mean, we're using all the resources that you've identified to basically push the vote out and to support Prop 16. We have a huge coalition of athletes and the various teams all in the Bay Area have endorsed Prop 16. We've got a long list of all of the stars, the movie stars, the Black movie stars, the Latino ones. We've got, of course, the coalition of all of the Latino elected officials, statewide elected officials, Asian elected officials, as well as statewide Chicano elected officials. So we've got a huge coalition of individuals who are just beginning to put their message out, to begin to lobby on behalf of this bill. We're hoping that it'll be a huge turnout. I mean, every community is pushing that, that this should be an important election. And we believe it is, not just for Prop 16, but it's an important election for everybody. And so the ballots are just going out. We hope to have a record turnout and in all the communities. And many of the surveys that are done generally don't survey all those hard to reach communities anyway. They only survey those who are the most likely voters, which oftentimes leave out so many, and also leave out the young people. We have an army of young people from the various universities who are basically handling this matter and dealing with all of the social media issues and what have you. They asked for affirmative action to be repealed, for Prop 209 to be repealed, mainly because they said they wanted a diverse student population and they wanted faculty and staff who looked more like them to basically create a real world for them in terms of education. And so, they are very committed to this because they see this as their future. This is what they want as a California. This is what they want as a world. And so it's important to these young folks to get the word out to their peers, and they're doing that.
Any other questions from the board?
Couple times, this isn't a perfect solution, but it's a start. So my question is, are there other things you're looking at doing? And, at a legislative level, what more could be done to systemic racism after this?
Well, this will help us as we try to do a number of things that we're looked at. We're looking, clearly, you've heard that we're going to deal with the issue of reparations. And that study in itself will help us to understand just how deep and how pervasive racism has been in terms of economics and education and opportunity and a whole lot of other things, and the various laws that we put in place in the past to basically have a negative impact upon African-American life and on others as well. We have begun to look at, we're looking at how can we increase our number of teachers. That's a very important part of this whole change in schools. How are we going to get more African-Americans and more Latinos into the schools and encourage them to come to the university? It's hard to develop a program focused in that area. And so I know our teachers union, as well as our Department of Education and our education committee, has talked about what can we do to really incentivize or to encourage or recruit young people to go into education and to make a difference in our schools. So that in itself will have a significant impact in terms of trying to change our schools and the things that are there. We've done some things in terms of financial assistance at the community college level. That's so much important as an entree into the universities. But what Proposition 16 will do is that it will give us an opportunity to do things. So, because so often when we mention anything about addressing an issue, addressing a problem, like when I was trying to get the $300 million to help kids who are still at the bottom, I had to deal with all of our attorneys about, is this against Prop 209? This is discriminatory, da, 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 da. And it just took forever to try to get a pot of money to focus on these kids who are at the very bottom, because there were so many barriers and there were so many challenges because of Prop 209. So we had to shape it in a way that was somewhat effective, but not as effective as it should have been. And I'm just optimistic that at least we can look at these issues we face in California in terms of educational disparity, looking at our small businesses, many of them that have failed as a result of COVID, and how are we going, we've talked to the governor, the caucus heads, about how we're going to try to restore some of these businesses. How are we going to create opportunities for that? The last economic downturn, we saw a lot of people lose their homes. And so as a result, the percentage of people who own homes, African Americans, is really, really low, like in the 20s. So what are we going to do to try to help improve that number? Because that's the entree into wealth in California. It becomes very difficult to try to do that if you're focusing on a particular group that's lost so much in the last economic downturn and then losing things this time without being race conscious at some point that you have a problem. How are you going to solve it? And if you do the broad thing like we did with the PPPs or whatever it was, you end up with a whole lot of folks not being able to get what they needed. And then you look and say, oh God, you know, we gave most of our money to these huge corporations who are, you know, multiple restaurants and so forth and so on. And little Joe's shack on the corner is gone, you know, because he couldn't compete. And so these are the things that we're optimistic about in terms of legislation, programs that might exist. We've got some cities like LA and some others that are already beginning to say, if this passes, this is what we can do. This is what we think we can do to change the narrative in Los Angeles and increase the number of businesses that we have among people of color and spread the wealth among more individuals than what we currently do. So it opens up an opportunity to do that. Without that, we're going to struggle like we do now. We will struggle to try to figure out specific programs that might address the issue and to get to that place. And we will be successful in a very modest way, but not in a major way that we know we'll have to address the economic issues and the educational issues and the recruitment of teachers, and it goes on and on and on. And we know that, and we've had these conversations, but it becomes very difficult to be effective when you're limited and you're banned from basically having any consideration of race or gender.
And if I might add, you know, I think there's never been a time where it's been more important. And so if our economy in California is going to recover, it's going to require all of us to be able to participate. And so the studies have shown that as a result of Prop 209, about $1.2 billion a year were lost from women and minority-owned contractors. And so you think about that $1.2 billion a year, you know, those were real dollars that would have gone to communities that need the support up here in the Bay Area. That's communities like East Palo Alto or the Bayview or the Tenderloin. And so, you know, when you sort of suck those resources out, it really prohibits the entire economy from being able to move forward. And so, you know, Prop 16, I would say it's necessary. It's much needed. Again, to repeat what I said before, it's not a mandate though. It simply eliminates a ban that then begins to allow local jurisdictions and agencies to come up with narrowly tailored solutions that will really help address very specific problems, but that ultimately bear consequences for the rest of us.
I just want to ask really quickly about the public contracting side of this. What do you feel people should know about why that's included, and how will Prop 16 help with it?
Well, I'll say a little bit, and maybe my colleagues would add. But when we think about public contracts, you know, that this is not just to build roads or train, rail, or firehouses. It actually includes a whole bunch of different government services, whether that's in communications or marketing or engineering. So the state of California is very large, and it contracts out to many companies. And for the most part, it's still an old boys network of very large corporations. And that if we're able to pass Prop 16, we can get more resources out to our people of color and women-owned businesses. But it's also not just the businesses that do, you know, work for the state. It's actually all the small business programs as well. And so one thing that 209 eliminated, it was what we used to have, you know, at least in San Francisco, programs that were designed to help women and minority business enterprises. And so that's to make sure that they have access to capital. That's to make sure that they have access to capacity building. That's to make sure that they are able to navigate the different you know, bureaucracies that we may have. And so actually the contracting thing implicates pretty much all aspects of economic development, right? And in a state that's as diverse as California, we cannot just rely on super big companies to lead the way. It's actually, you know, important to invest in Main Street, and Main Street in California now are businesses owned by women and people of color. You
know, when I was, I chaired the Citizen Equal Opportunity Commission in San Diego, representing the mayor at the time. And that was in 2010, 2009, 10, 11, and before I went to the assembly in 2012. And we knew data. Data showed us in the 90s, in the mid 90s, that the contracts for women and minority businesses were like 30 to 40% any particular year, where we had a number of our communities, all of our communities being adequately represented. When I was on the commission, the number of women in minority contracting was 1.5% in San Diego. That was from women and minorities, 1.5%. And I used to go to meetings and tell women they should be outraged because white women lost an awful lot in Prop 209 in terms of their ability to do contracting with the city. And city contracts and county contracts are great because they stabilize businesses where it may be difficult to interact with other entities and get paid on time or whatever it may be. It does stabilize and it becomes a background and the backbone for many businesses in San Diego. The interesting thing with Proposition 209, most of us didn't realize at the time, that Prop 209 was supported and pushed by the business community, not by the education community. They thought the education was more the emotional issue, that people would be outraged and they could do the divide between Latinos and African Americans and Asians, and they would all be fighting over limited seats at the university. Meanwhile, it was really funded by the building industry. And they were the ones who benefited immensely as a result of the end of affirmative action and continue to do so to this day. When I talk with Los Angeles business, I guess one of their groups I was with, they told me that 2% of all contracts in Los Angeles are Latinos, 2% are women, and less than 1% is African American. That 95% of all contracts go to white men in Los Angeles, one of the most diverse cities you would ever find. So it is important because it talks about giving people a future. It talks about the hiring that's done. It talks about investments in communities. It talks about all of those things that start bridging the wealth gap. And if you can't do that, if you can't do business, what we see is a lot of people leave. And I've seen lots of African Americans leave San Diego as a result of it. I don't know what's happening with my thing. My thing has gone crazy on me. I'm supposed to be in something else at this time. But we've seen that shift, too many meetings. In fact, it's a Prop 209, Prop 16 rally. But anyway, but we've seen the shift. We've seen the shift that's there, and it's a major shift. And business is extremely important. And women and those who are trying to make a difference and increase their income and increase the income of their communities and growth and development, it's critical. And so the data shows very clearly that women, particularly women, lose out immensely in terms of when affirmative action was eliminated.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. And I think that's a literal note to end on right there. That phone call. I appreciate your time. That was a fast hour. If we have more questions for you, we'll reach out, but we really, really appreciate the time today.
Thank you,
Thank you
guys.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Care.
Thank you so
Bye-bye
much.
now.